This week on Waterways, Acropora, Elkhorn and Staghorn corals, and Parson Jones, the philosopher of Porgy Key. Coral reefs are amazing, full of color and life. They are an important oasis for marine life, offering food and shelter. But they are important for people too, supporting local economies and providing coastal protection. Two of the reef's key species are Elkhorn and Staghorn coral. These unique branching acroporid corals have literally built the structure of the reefs in South Florida. But will they continue to do so forever? Recently, they were listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Acroporids are the coral most people fondly remember the first time they visit a reef. Acroporids are unique in that they are the only two branching hard corals in the Caribbean. Elkhorn branches into large flat arms that resemble elk antlers, while Staghorn has smaller, cylindrical pointed branches that make it look like a large tumbleweed. Healthy acroporids grow in dense patches called thickets that look like underwater forests. They shelter a wide variety of fish and animals. Elkhorn in particular look quite majestic, with its branches reaching up towards the sunlight. Acroporids are typically found on the shallow crest of the reef, but the Caribbean's only two acroporids are disappearing in South Florida.
I've been in the park for a long time. When I first started the park, acroporids were fairly abundant in most areas of the park. And then over the years, I noticed that the acropora population in the park was slowly starting to decline. And then probably in the early 90s to mid 90s, it looked like, except for one or two areas in the park, there were no more acroporids. And even those eventually dried up, so that about 4 or 5 years ago, we didn't have any acroporid corals that we knew of. And then about 3 years ago, we noticed that the acroporid colonies appeared to be coming back. And it was important to document how they were coming back, because people have always assumed that coral loss on the reef platform is due to some anthropogenic or man-generated pressure, or response to a man-generated pressure. In actuality, it may be some long-term biological function that allows that population to just swing.
Scientists at Biscayne National Park are working to answer the question, are the acroporids coming or going?
We're actually doing several things when we do our surveys. We're trying to look at distribution of corals. We're basically towing people around, and when they see a coral, we give them a GPS unit. We get the GPS units or coordinates for that particular coral colony. Right now, the colony abundance is low enough that we can easily do that on a single reef where we may have 50 colonies of coral or less. Some reefs, depending on where we are, may have 1 or 2 colonies.
It will take more than just locating and mapping acroporids to understand the status of the population. Corals face a suite of challenges, such as hurricanes, disease, and poor water quality. Rising sea levels and increasing ocean temperatures associated with climate change may also present challenges. When water gets too hot for corals, they become stressed and bleach, which means they expel their symbiotic algae that help them photosynthesize to make food from sunlight. If this happens for an extended period of time, the corals will die. Looking at the genetics of these corals is also a key to assessing their health. The more genetically diverse a population is, the healthier it is likely to be.
There are a couple of things about the biology of Acropora species that make them particularly challenging for research in one regard, and also particularly challenging in terms of management and assessment of their status. For one thing, Acropora species are able to reproduce clonally by fragmentation. That means that when a branch breaks off of a colony, either from a hurricane or from a snorkeler kicking it or whatever sort of physical disturbance, that individual branch, where if it falls in an appropriate position on the reef, is able to form a new colony. This has a lot of implications for the biology of the species, because that means that if we go out and count the number of coral colonies, the number of acropora colonies at a particular reef, we have no idea how many genetic individuals those colonies represent because of this tendency for fragmentation. Because that means that the colonies that originate from a fragment of another colony represent clones of each other, or a single genetic individual. So one of the research aims that our team had tackled was to develop genetic tools to be able to distinguish and understand exactly how many genetic individuals were present in a given population.
A thicket of acropora that is all one clone leads to inbreeding when they reproduce. As time passes, genetic weaknesses can accumulate, such as increased vulnerability to disease, strange tumor-like growths, or the clones could lose their ability to reproduce. Acropora populations in South Florida are becoming more isolated, which reduces sexual reproduction, leaving fragmentation as the only means for them to reproduce. This magnifies their vulnerabilities.
In 2006, both Acropora palmata and Acropora cervicornis were listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. And this determination was made because the National Marine Fisheries Service determined that there was a likelihood that both these species would become in danger of extinction in the near future. This assessment is based on the information that has been pulled together from a few sites in the Caribbean where we have quantitative data, but throughout the Caribbean where folks' observations and anecdotal information suggest that these species have declined a huge amount since around the early 1980s. In the sites where we have been able to piece together quantitative information, it appears that the decline between, say, 1980 and the year 2000 or so, over 2 decades, is somewhere in the range of 90 to 97% decline. So that represents a huge loss to these coral reef ecosystems.
Acroporids in South Florida and the Keys seem to be in particularly bad shape. Part of the threatened listing includes formulating a recovery plan for the species. The work at Biscayne National Park will help scientists get a better idea of where colonies are in the park. One ray of hope is that populations in the Eastern Caribbean seem to be faring better. But in the context of climate change and other potential threats, nothing is guaranteed.
Because acropora species corals have the highest growth rates of any species in Caribbean coral reef ecosystems, if they are lost, this represents a serious concern in terms of the maintenance of coral reef structure in the Caribbean. The physical structure, the rock formations that acropora species corals construct provide the primary habitat, most of the rock that constructs Caribbean coral reefs. And this is important as the habitat for all the other creatures that Caribbean coral reefs house. So in the absence of acropora species corals, it's likely that, and particularly in the context of increasing acidity and other aspects, possibly increasing hurricanes, all of these forces that cause erosion of that reef substrate, in the absence of high abundance of acropora species, the expectation is that these rock structures that support Caribbean reef diversity are gradually going to be whittled and eroded away.
Acroporids are significant because they build the reefs of South Florida, but they also provide important ecosystem functions. Live elkhorn and staghorn form rusty brown thickets that resemble underwater forests. They provide essential habitat for a thriving community of marine creatures, from fish to lobster to octopus. In stark contrast are the acropora graveyards, where whole thickets have died and nothing but the gray skeletons remain.
Another ecological value that these shallow thickets provide, the reef construction that they provide, is in protecting our shorelines from erosion, particularly as we've recently become more aware of the concern and the threat that hurricanes pose in terms of our own homes, shallow reef structures are a primary factor that can protect human settlements as well from the erosive forces of the ocean and storms.
Coral reefs also benefit people who live thousands of miles away from them.
A lot of the fish that we eat come from areas that have high structural relief. And the highest structural relief is in a coral reef ecosystem. So the amount of fish production that you can get out of a coral reef system is markedly increased. So even though you're remote to a coral reef ecosystem, the byproducts of that coral reef ecosystem are very important to your lifestyle. And even someone in the middle of Iowa would eventually feel the loss of a coral reef ecosystem. For example, some of the thickening agents that you use in cooking come from marine organisms or have a marine origin. So it's not just fish that you're eating, it's a whole bunch of other byproducts and medications that are being generated by a better understanding of coral reef ecosystems and a better management of coral reef ecosystems.
Acroporids were the first corals to be listed under the Endangered Species Act, and they likely won't be the last. On a local scale, people can help protect Elkhorn and Staghorn corals by not anchoring on or touching the reef, and by making sure no trash ends up in the marine environment. The public can also help keep coral reefs healthy by carefully choosing which seafood to eat. Species that are responsibly harvested without damaging the reef are best. Elkhorn and Staghorn corals are a rare and beautiful sight on South Florida's reefs. They play a valuable role in sustaining the reef's diversity and productivity. As scientists grapple to understand the mysterious, dramatic declines of acropora corals, concerned citizens can all play a role in protecting those that remain. Not long ago, across the waters of Biscayne National Park, on an island overgrown with vegetation, a park ranger made a startling discovery. The tiny island, considered inhospitable by modern living standards, showed signs of a homestead. The news of the mysterious homestead quickly made its way to Biscayne National Park's archaeologist and history sleuth.
As soon as we stepped on the island, I noted that there were some artifacts that weren't normally associated with marine debris, things that would wash up on a shoreline. He and I cleared away a small part of the dense overgrowth that was in that inner tidal zone, and we actually cleared away enough that we found the lower portion of a foundation, house foundation. And this was really exciting to me because I had no idea that that house foundation had ever existed out there.
The home site is located on Porgy Key and is accessible only with a shallow draft boat. Brenda returned to the island over the next few weeks and cleared away more brush. As the foundation was revealed, so would be clues to who lived here.
Once we started hacking away at the area across the front of the structure, we saw the stairs, realized it was the remains of an entire foundation of a home, and that's when we noticed the plaque that had been put in place. And so we knew we were on something that at least some community members had thought fairly highly of the individuals that had lived here at one point.
Inscribed on the plaque was the name Israel Lafayette Jones. When Brenda asked around at park headquarters, no one knew who Israel was. But she was told about a black gentleman named Lancelot Jones, who lived on the island when Biscayne National Monument was formed in 1968.
At the time, I had extremely limited resources to be able to devote any sort of historical research or archaeological investigation into trying to unfold the mystery of who this site actually belonged to and why it was important to community members. As luck would have it, senior high school students from Homestead Senior High School Social Science Honor Club was looking for a service learning project as part of their school curriculum.
The students' initial research in local archives uncovered an obituary about the philosopher of Porgy Key, a man named Israel Jones, known to his friends and admirers as Parson Jones. Then, the most fortuitous development occurred. In 2003, a PhD scholar named Dr. Carolyn Finney showed up at Brenda's office at Biscayne National Park.
She actually showed up in the park one day wanting to conduct a visitor survey on blacks and how they related to the environment. And one of the historical myths about African Americans in the United States is that they are not connected to the environment at all. So she's trying to challenge that myth in her dissertation work.
As their initial conversation progressed, Brenda asked Dr. Finney if she had heard of Parson Jones. Dr. Finney was immediately intrigued, and Brenda recruited her as the perfect person to fully research the man they called Parson Jones.
What I started to do was actually read all the material that already existed. I mean, the first thing I had to recognize is actually I had a treasure trove of material, both that the high school kids had collected, as well as diaries from people who had lived at that time and who wrote about the family and wrote very specifically about Parson Jones, lots and lots of newspaper articles. So I literally sat down and started reading through everything.
Dr. Finney first traveled to North Carolina, where Parson Jones was born, to access important slaveholding records. Her research then brought her to Jacksonville. The obituary mentioned that Parson Jones spent some time there, and as Dr. Finney dug through the records, Brenda dug out the homestead site. By excavating and cleaning the foundation, Brenda was able to piece together the presence of a very advanced structure.
At some point after Hurricane Andrew, the massive pillars that once stood on the corners of the porch fell down, and this is actually the remains of them now. They almost look like seats. I think people who do visit the site come and use them for seats. But this would have been a screened-in porch area here. And then this would have been the entrance to the main portion of the house.
The house was constructed between 1906 and 1912 by Parson Jones and his brother Samuel. Brenda Lansendorf and Dr. Carolyn Finney were hooked. With each new fact uncovered came a clearer picture of this fascinating man. Israel Lafayette Jones was born in 1858 in Raleigh, North Carolina. His father was listed in North Carolina archives as a land laborer, which was another way of saying a slave. Between his childhood in North Carolina and his adult life in South Florida, Parson Jones spent time in Wilmington, North Carolina. In 1892, Parson Jones headed to Florida in search of work. At first, he tried his hand at growing oranges in Orlando, but was unsuccessful due to a freeze. After a short stint in Tampa, he made his way further south. He soon settled in Key Biscayne, and for 9 years Parson Jones worked as a caretaker. In 1895, Parson married a Bahamian transplant named Moselle, and they soon had their first son, Arthur Lafayette Jones, born in March of 1897. Their second son, Lancelot Garfield Jones, was born almost a year and a half later in October of 1898.
He got interested in the pineapples up here. All this was, Elliott Key was just beautifully cultivated in pineapples, and he had a month off, June each year, for vacation. So he'd sail down through and meet these people, and everybody was so joyful about their pineapple business. And so he said, well, now, gee whiz, I have a couple of dollars. I want to do something aside from being a caretaker. So he inquired of these people along, did they know anyone here was interested, would be interested in selling some of their property so he could get started in the pineapple culture himself.
Parson Jones bought Porgy Key for $300.
But in those days, for a black man to go up to a white man and say, I want to be able to buy this land, because and for me it's important to remind us that also means I'm saying I want to be able to have the freedom to do what I want to do. Are you going to allow me to do that if I give you the right price?
To me, one of the greatest elements to this story is that typically when you think about black history and what's being taught to our school children, even today, It's usually stories about oppression and subjugation, and it's very negative, and there's a reason for that, but it leads us to think that that's the entire history of African American experience in the United States. What's great about this story is here's this man who is historically significant because of his work ethics, because of his morality, because of his values, because of his philosophy towards life.
So he lived during a contentious time in history. The color of his skin, the fact that he started off with no money in his pocket, and he decides to carve out a place for himself, literally to carve out a place for himself in the South, where there's facts to show that he probably wasn't welcome with open arms, but he was going to do it anyway, and make it work for himself and his family, and I would guess to say as well for his community. It tells me something about what we can imagine for ourselves in place.
Parson Jones died in 1932 when he was 73 years old. Moselle had died 5 years prior. Upon his death, Parson left the islands to his 2 sons, Arthur and Lancelot. The house that Lancelot had grown up in burned down in the 1980s, but Lancelot built a caretaker shack and stayed there until the day before Hurricane Andrew hit in 1992. When the hurricane flattened everything, he finally left his home on the island to never return. Lancelot Jones died in 1997 in Miami from natural causes. The Jones family, through the direction of Lancelot, completed one final business deal that would contribute to their legacy in South Florida. Lancelot Jones sold his property to the National Park Service rather than making 3 times as much had he sold it to developers.
In 1968, when Biscayne National Monument was formed, it was in essence a show that the preservationists won the battle between the developers and themselves. Lancelot Jones was an integral part to that because he sold his property to the Department of Interior with the understanding is that he could live the remainder of his years on the island.
Currently, the Jones site is deteriorating rapidly. Brenda's plan is to first stabilize the site. This will not only help to preserve what is left, but it will ensure that the future visitors have a safe experience. It will take time, and it will take money. But Brenda is confident that the community will come together to preserve this historic place.
Biscayne National Park is located in South Florida, which is wildly ethnically diverse. And cultural resources, natural resources, if we can instill that sense of ownership among our community members, then the park visitors will begin to closer reflect the demographic constituents of the communities that they're in.
This glimpse into the story of the philosopher of Porgy Key is an encouragement to any who hear the tale. The man who inspired so many during his lifetime continues to inspire. For everyone who fights for a better life, for every person who is up against insurmountable odds, for those who buck the system, need only remember the life of Parson Jones and know that anything is possible.